Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Shawna Pandya. She has many titles: Medical Strategic Research Advisor, Vice President of Immersive Medicine, Chief Instructor of Operational Space Medicine. There's even more, but I like to keep these intros short, so I won't go over all of them. So I'm really keen to ask her about these titles, and also I'm interested to learn how public speaking has benefited her career. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Dr. Pandya.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Neil.
From the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you got a degree in neuroscience. What was the motivation to get that degree?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's a very specific reason I pursued neuroscience, other than it's interesting, of course. So many, like many young children, I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up. And I was growing up during the time when Dr. Roberta Bondar, Canada's first female astronaut, flew to space. And so I said, well, she's Canadian, I'm Canadian, she's female, I'm female. So to be like her, I just need to go be a neuroscientist, physician, and then astronaut like her. And then boom, it's done. So I was convinced I would study neuroscience and then medicine. And that was the motivation for pursuing a neuroscience degree.
Okay, so you wanted to be like Dr. Roberta Bondar. But I saw you got a master's in space science. Was that motivated by her as well?
That was a unplanned, but ultimately looking back, life-changing detour. So when I was applying to medical school, I realized that, hey, I need a backup plan because when you look at the caliber of candidates who is applying to medical school and who aren't even getting interviews, much less getting in, I realized that might not get into medical school. And I wanted to spend the year doing something I was equally passionate about, uh, even if I didn't get into medical school. So I had heard about something that had been called the International Space University and still is. It's a master's program in Strasbourg, France. It's like Starfleet Academy, where people come from all over the world, every discipline, to learn about space. So space technology, space policy, space life sciences, space medicine. And that's where I really learned about the global space industry, where I learned about um, how we can integrate space into our careers. And I was lucky enough to get into both medical school and the master's program in the same year. And then I realized, hey, space was the motivation behind this the whole time. So I asked for a deferral to the medical school faculty. To my surprise, they said yes. And that was the beginning of this life-changing journey of learning about all of these things that I just mentioned and doing an internship at the European Astronaut Center in the Crew Medical Support Office and realizing that you can actually make space and space medicine part of your career. And that was really the springboard into a brand new career into space medicine and keeping that in mind as I went through medical school.
Okay. So when you say space medicine, what does that mean?
That's a great question. I get asked that often because people say, how are space and medicine related? And it makes sense when you consider that space essentially is trying to kill us. So, what I mean by that is that the space flight environment is full of challenges and hazards. The first obvious one that comes to mind is microgravity, so weightlessness. And every single bodily system is affected by the space flight environment. So, bones lose density, muscles lose mass, our fluids shift upward. And on top of that, there's increased radiation. There's a highly stressful operational schedule that is scheduled down to the 5-minute mark on the International Space Station. There is the further we go, the more of a time delay there is. So at the level of the International Space Station, you have instantaneous communications. By the time you get to Mars, depending on the alignment of the two planets, it can be up to 46 minutes round trip communication delay. So I would say hello, 23 minutes later, you would hear that, and then you would say your hello back. So you have to think about making your crew more autonomous. There's the challenges of things we learned from the Apollo era, that lunar dust is a very real skin and respiratory irritant. So there's all of these challenges that we need to think about when we talk about sending humans to space, and that's why the field of space medicine exists.
Okay. I remember when I was in school, there was a professor who worked on bone loss. with people in space, but he wasn't working with people. He was working on rats, I think. So they were sending up these rats into space, and they were coming down, and then they see that their bones weren't as strong as they were when they were initially on planet Earth. And I guess that has to do with the lesser gravity in space.
Absolutely. And there's actually a follow-up to that now because in 2020, the Rodent Research 19 experiment came back from the International Space Station. And what the researchers had done is they had introduced a mutant mouse with increased muscle mass. And it had this thing called the ACVR2 neuromuscular blockade. And basically, what that meant is these mice were less prone to losing bone density loss and less muscle mass. And so if you look at these mice, they're these adorable jacked up little mice, and compared to a normal non-mutant mouse. And what they found was, in fact, as expected, they had in some cases increased bone muscle mass, and in some cases less bone density loss compared to the non-mutant mice.
So does that mean all the astronauts that go up in space from now on need to be a bit jacked? No skinny people.
Well, we aren't necessarily doing genetic enhancement on astronauts in space, but we are we do have them perform countermeasures in space. And so what I mean by that is exercise is a good way of mitigating bone density and muscle mass loss. So actually, while they're on station, astronauts have to perform 2 hours of aerobic and resistive exercise 6 days a week on top of everything else. And they also have to perform pre-flight as well as post-flight rehabilitation.
Wow. Okay. So you don't need to be a bodybuilder necessarily to go become an astronaut. That's good to know. I'm sure.
No, but you should be fit.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Fit's good enough. But you should be fit anyway. But definitely
Yeah.
going up into space is it's a requirement for sure. From what you have done now since you've been out of school, I'm assuming that you worked as a actually I shouldn't even assume that. Did you actually end up working as a medical doctor?
Yeah, I do. I still do that full time on top of everything else. So I started out in neurosurgery, kind of propelled by this love of neuroscience, and then I realized that that's pretty far away from space. I switched to general practice and then completed my residency, and now spend my time working in rural emergency rooms all across the province, which is really fun because you're working in all manner of resource remote um, isolated communities. And it really is this problem solving on the spot. You have to be this sort of medical MacGyver and use what you have at your disposal. And you have to be prepared for whatever comes in the door. So it's like a box of medical chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get.
Wow. So you work as a physician currently, and yet I mentioned in the intro a whole bunch of other titles that you have. Where do you find the time to do all this stuff?
Lots of caffeine, um, caffeine and time management and support from good people in my life.
Wonderful. That's excellent. So let's talk. I'm just interested to even mention or to learn more about the various things that you do. So I mentioned you're a medical strategic research advisor. What does that entail?
Yeah, so through my background in space medicine, I've been lucky enough to start to advise commercial space companies. So the medical research strategic advisor position is with a company called Orbital Assembly. And this is a commercial space company aiming to put the world's first artificial gravity space station in orbit by the end of the decade. And if you want to get a sense of what that means, it's straight out of Space Odyssey 2001, this rotating space station that, by virtue of physics, rate of rotation and radius of the space station can generate different amounts of partial gravity. So I am the medical advisor there. I also advise another company called Astrius, and they are focused on space food and keeping astronauts happy and healthy in space flight.
All right. And I also mentioned in the intro that you're the VP of Immersive Medicine. What does that mean?
Yeah, this is another space company I work with more directly, a space and Earth company, I should say. So that's Luxonic Technologies. We leverage immersive technologies. So that means virtual reality, augmented reality, 360 video to help with healthcare education, training, and delivery. So we've created the world's first virtual reality radiology reading room and a headset. So instead of imagining a radiologist with all these monitors and all this space and tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, we put that into virtual reality while maintaining the resolution of images. So now if you are a physician needing to read images, but you're in the middle of nowhere, you can still read as long as you have a headset with you.
All right. And then also Chief Instructor of Operational Space Medicine. What does that entail?
Yeah, that is through my position at the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. I say IIAS because otherwise it gets quite cumbersome to say. So that is the scientist, astronaut, and citizen science not-for-profit I work with. I am the director of their space medicine group, and it started when I completed their ground school, took part in many operational courses, and then was asked to put together a course on space medicine based on my background and expertise. And that's where the operational space medicine course comes in. I've been running it since 2017, have had a blast. And really all these principles that we've talked about so far, this conversation, being a medical MacGyver, working in resource limited settings, learning all about space medicine, teamwork, that's what the course teaches.
Is your goal eventually to become an astronaut? And if so,
Absolutely.
what's the process to become one?
Yeah, that's a great question because these days, when we look at what it takes to be an astronaut, there's more paths towards becoming an astronaut than existed previously. So traditionally, it was you had to be selected through a space agency, whether that's the Canadian Space Agency, NASA, the European Space Agency. So that starts with being highly qualified, typically having a STEM degree, pilot background, military background, and then also being physically fit, physiologically fit, a good team player, psychologically fit, and then going through all the rounds of selection. And that is still a path towards becoming an astronaut. In fact, ESA and the NASA have all announced recent classes within the last 2 years. But it's also a bit of a medical genetic lottery because you could be the perfect candidate and you could be screened out for having a medical condition you didn't know about. And so, with the rise of commercial space, when you have companies like Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, Axiom, being able to give people access to space without going through the agency selection. Not to say that you shouldn't have all those things. You should still be physically fit. You should still be the best in your field. You should still be a good team player. That also gives us access towards being able to fly to space through suborbital and orbital flight, and paths that didn't exist when you and I were growing up.
Okay. So when you have various space agencies, do they work together? Do they go up into space together? Is that how that works? Or is it kind of a separate thing? The Americans do their thing, the Europeans do their thing, the Canadians do their thing, that kind of thing.
The greatest part about space is that it's extremely internationally collaborative. It's hard, it's expensive, and it's high risk. We wouldn't be able to do what we do on the International Space Station without that international collaboration. And so when we talk about how the ISS is run, it's run by what we call the Big Five. So that would be NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency. And they're the ones who take responsibility for various aspects of the space station, whether it's construction and delivery of modules. Canada's contribution has been the Canadarm and Dexter robotic arms, and that's how the partners operate. That's how they decide who flies up to the station. So space is extraordinarily international, and when we look to the future of human space exploration, there's a very real push to get back to the moon. That means the international parties are currently planning the humanity's first deep space station, the Lunar Gateway, in orbit around the moon. So that will also be a partnership between Canada, the United States, Japan, and the European Space Agency. And there's also a push to send humans to the moon with, again, the usual partners.
Okay, that's so interesting. I mean, I had a guest on this channel a few months ago, and he's a professor, and he's an expert in space junk and how
Oh, wow.
yeah. So to trying to get less of it, well, to remove more of it, and he was saying that it's an international effort. And I just remember thinking, I think I might have even mentioned this during our conversation that you mentioned there were five, those five space agencies, but not all countries are members of those 5 space agencies, but yet the effort to get rid of all that space junk, those agencies want it to be an international effort. So you could have a country that's not part of one of those agencies, but yet they're being asked to contribute to removing junk that they weren't responsible for putting up there in the first place. And I always thought that might be a hard sell.
There is, and there's, that's a great discussion. So I should be clear that that space junk, what we call micrometeorite orbital debris, uh, uh, it can come from debris that's not part of human-made debris, or junk. So it can just be micrometeorites. And that's something that we can't control. But there's also satellites. And even if you're not a nation that's part of the ISS and human spaceflight, many countries have access and build and launch their own satellites for Earth observation, telecommunications, and remote sensing. And oftentimes it's the satellites that contribute to space junk and orbital debris. And there is an imperative, even if you're not a part of human spaceflight, even if it's not to keep astronauts safe, it's looking towards the future, because if space traffic around Earth gets more congested, that's going to mean a more difficult future in space for all of us. And then on top of that, even as we have countries becoming emerging space nations, we want to make it easier for them to have access to space as well. So there is definitely an imperative to include all players, established and emerging, in the space debris conversation.
Interesting. Dr. Pandya, when I first started this channel, it had to do with learning about people's public speaking journeys, and I learned about their career journeys too. But ultimately, it really is about the public speaking part, because when I first started giving presentations working as an engineer, I wasn't that great at it, but I saw the benefit of getting better at it. And when with someone like yourself, who is more of a space expert, and there's a lot of people, I just mentioned countries that don't have anything to do with any space program being asked to remove space junk, and that might be a hard sell to them. You're going to have to be a really good communicator to convince them that this is something that they should get on board with. Is speaking in front of people, is that something that you've always been good at? And if not, what'd you do to get better at it?
That's a great question. My parents were always convinced I was good at it. I don't know that I actually was, but they were so convinced that it was just a natural part of childhood to go be part of the debate club, to go be part of speech crafters. They were lifelong Toastmasters. So they, brought me into some of their Toastmasters events. And so it was something I was always very much around. I was told I was good at it. I don't know that in retrospect that it may or may not have been true, but there were also times when I overthought it, and became a little bit nervous, and that took some steps back, and then had to kind of dissect, hey, how did I start off not being nervous in front of audiences? And that was a huge part of it. And then from then on, as you say, communication is so critical, whether you're in science, whether you're in medicine, being able to dissect and distill complex thoughts down to easily understandable terminology and analogies is so critical. And so I wanted to share my journey when it came to public speaking. So if anyone asked me to speak, I would say yes. I never thought it would lead anywhere. Um, but then over time, it led to 3 TEDx talks. I'm a speaker with the National Speakers Bureau. I've been to Qatar, Mexico, Japan, Scotland through sharing my journey. So there's a big lesson and a huge value in saying yes, even when you don't know where the journey is going to take you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. I mean, there's a lot of talk out there about being strategic in the decisions that you make, and that's important, and that's important and all. But there's something to be said about sometimes just saying yes and not really, as you mentioned, not knowing where it's going to lead. That is this going to lead to something that's useful to me? And you may not know, but it might. And so you say yes and let the chips fall where they may. When it comes to the presentations that you do you have a process for putting them together? And if so, what is it?
Absolutely. So when it's a brand new keynote, it's hours of it's days, it's sometimes weeks and months of preparation. And so for some of my most important talks, once upon a time, for the really, really important ones, it would be pages written out word by word. And it's not to say I would memorize every word. It's so I would want to know the important vernacular and flow and there's certain terminology and phrases and how they would blend together that I would want to say. And then over time, as I become I became more comfortable with what my speaking matter was, I don't write out speeches anymore, but I do take copious notes well ahead of time. I create a living document. If it's an event that I am fortunate to be part of for like a conference or a retreat for more than just my speaking slot, I really value that because then I take notes as to what was said days earlier so I can bring the audience back to this shared event that we're all part of. Knowing the audience is so critical. And in fact, when I briefly became nervous as a teenager, what brought me back to that was not just dissecting my own speaking technique, but saying, how do I connect with the audience? And suddenly that took all the nerves away because it's not about me, it's about them, it's about how they feel. And early on, some of the mistakes I made with keynotes, being so obsessed with giving the audience value, was making it too technical. And those talks weren't as well received. And the answer is because it's about how you make people feel. And that's a huge driver behind my talks. And so the other stuff, making the images, the videos, those came later. It's more thinking about, what is the emotion behind this? How did I feel? How's the story going to come across? And that's probably a key driver in my keynotes.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, especially when it comes to technical presentations. Talking when you're talking in front of non-technical audiences, it's going to be it could very well be a tough sell. They may very well be interested in the topic, but because their level of expertise isn't the same as your own, you have to be very mindful of how you present the information. And the fact that you have a living document that you work on to figure what that is, I think that's a smart move, because what you can do is really take the time to think critically about what am I going to say and what words am I going to use to say it. Because if you use a whole bunch of technical jargon in front of a non-technical audience, once you look up, you're going to see a bunch of people on their phones. You're going to see a bunch of people falling asleep. You might see some people walking out. You're going to see a bunch of things that perhaps you really don't want to see. So yeah, I certainly take your point there.
And one point I should add to that, as you're saying that, looking at the audience reaction, is connecting with the audience afterwards is really important. So I really value question periods, especially with the students and the learners, because they have the best questions. They're not kind of at that stage where it's like, oh, is it okay if I ask this question? They just want to know. And then even if it's an event you're at, even for a little bit, just hearing people's feedback is critical. People will share their own experiences, and that also really helps solidify those connections.
Yeah, I am. What I this is definitely something that I've grown into, is asking questions, even if I'm worried that the question might sound dumb. But I'll ask it anyway, because oftentimes there's other people in the audience that had that same question, but they were worried about asking it because they were afraid to be dumb. So if anyone's going to look like they're going to be dumb, hell, let it be me. I don't mind. I've definitely gotten past that concern. What
Absolutely.
So, if you were to offer somebody who is listening to this podcast or watching this YouTube video on what they could do, the number one thing that they can do right now to improve or become more effective at giving presentations or at public speaking in general, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first answer is just say yes, look for opportunities, even if it's just an audience of one. And we've all been there. We've been in audiences that were very, very tiny, but it's because you want to be there, you want to share your story. So that goes into the second piece of advice: is focus on why. Why are you doing this, and how do you want the audience to feel? Because when you focus on the bigger picture, it's suddenly not about nerves. It's not about you on a stage and hundreds or thousands of people in front of you. It's about, even if it's just one person, what do you want them to come out of your talk knowing and feeling?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. basically it's figuring out what that call to action is. What do you really want them to do or feel, as you mentioned, after the presentation? Because you're obviously you're not putting a presentation just to get up there and talk in front of people. There has to be some sort of purpose purpose behind it, and figuring that out. Before certainly figuring out beforehand makes sense. You're certainly not going to do it while you're up there talking. When I think about that, it reminds me of a conversation I once had with a friend, and he makes fun of me for the fact that I prepare my presentations beforehand. He's way more, I guess, talking off the cuff when he gives presentations, but it shows though. And I don't think it's better, because when you talk off the cuff and you don't prepare, whatever you say comes out as it comes out. You didn't put any thought into the best way to convey this information. So you may very well have an audience that's looking at you potentially confused about what you're talking about, maybe irritated about what you're talking about. You're just bored about what you're talking about because you didn't take the time to figure out the best way to put the information together. And that's what I do when it comes to preparation. It's not just making sure that I use the right words. It's what do I want? What do I want out of this presentation? What do I think the people want out of this presentation? What do I need to do to put this information in a way that they can take in and really understand? It's just that takes, as you mentioned, it takes some time. So I don't know about months, but it takes some time to figure all that out. So I fully agree with everything that you've said. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, Dr. Shawna Pandya at Shawna Pandya, or you can reach me at my website if you want me to speak to your audiences, shawnapandya.com.
Excellent. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. I'm Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek, and you can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Dr. Pandya.
Bye.